Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first community meeting for parents of our TAG students. We're so happy you're here. We're going to get started right at 5 o'clock, but wanted to get everybody into the webinar and make sure all of the technology was working and point you in the direction of interpretation if that is something you or your family would like to take advantage of tonight.
Bienvenidos a todos y vamos a empezar en un momento. Si quieres escuchar la presentación en español, puedes seleccionar el botón de Interpretation o Interpretación en la parte inferior de la pantalla. Parece como un globo abajo en la pantalla y tiene que seleccionar o silenciar el audio original para escuchar solo en español. Y vamos a empezar en un momento.
Okay, in order to be respectful of everyone's time, we are going to start right at 5 o'clock. Good evening again. My name is Melissa Barron, and I am the Associate Director of Teaching and Learning here in Tigard-Tualatin School District. And I'd just like to welcome you to this evening. We are really looking forward to just a time to connect with you and touch base about where we are at with providing services for our gifted students and just answer any questions that maybe are out there that we haven't had an opportunity to answer now that we're into end of school year. Next slide, please. Tonight, we are going to present a lot of information, really focusing on the types of services that we are providing to our students who are identified as gifted. And one thing I want to make sure that you know is that we are recording this session. It is being interpreted and translated into Spanish. And so all of those links will be available sometime later this week that you can access on our Talented and Gifted website that you can find on the main TTSD website. And so know that we know that there's going to be a lot of information and probably a lot of questions, but we encourage you to take advantage of the Q&A that's set up that will be able to answer questions. We'll be able to type responses. And then if there are additional questions that we're unable to answer tonight, we will get back to you and we will make sure that there's an FAQ that answers additional questions if we're unable to answer them tonight. So again, some of the things that we will be addressing tonight are really looking at making sure that you can understand how we deliver gifted services, identify some impactful differentiation strategies, and then talk about what it might look like to advocate with your teachers or for your students with your students' teachers. And so that is what we are going to spend our time talking about. Tonight, Melissa, I am joined. Yeah,
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to interrupt you quickly, just remind you that the interpreter's translating simultaneously.
Okay,
so we just have to pace ourselves and slow down a little bit. Thank you.
Totally fine. Thank you, Lisa, for the reminder. And I'm sorry, Mariella. So that is what we're going to be doing tonight. I want to start also by introducing everyone who is joining me as panelists in this conversation. So joining me tonight are our 612 literacy TOSA who focuses on differentiation for rate and level, Shveta Miller.
Hi, everyone.
Are some TAG specialists, Melissa Jaskowiak, who works with our students at Alberta Ryder and Byram.
Hi.
Do you want me to let you guys introduce yourselves? Karen Hugart is here with us as well. Dr. Kristen Sachs is here. And Michael Rooney, who are working at our middle schools, supporting our students.
Hi.
Oh, and I just see that Stephanie Clark also joined us tonight. So they are here to help us answer questions and support, let you know how we are going to support students. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shveta.
Hi, everyone. I'm glad to have so many of you joining us tonight. I know it's 5 o'clock and a lot of us are joining from various places. So I am going to actually read some stuff to you because you might be driving or cooking dinner or wrapping up things at work. So I don't want you to have to look at the slide that we're talking about. But what I want to open with is we're going to spend maybe a good 15-20 minutes talking about a particular part of the services, the most critical part of your child's services here in our district, which is the type of instruction that they are getting in their classrooms all day, every day. Which is differentiated instruction for their assessed rate and level of learning. And before what we want to do is make sure that after you leave today, you have a much clearer sense of what that instruction looks like, so that you can ask more pointed questions to your child and have a better sense when you hear them talk about their school day, how those services are impacting them every day, and then to move forward as a partner with your classroom, with your child's teachers, to ensure those services are really being provided in the most appropriate way for your students. So before we start talking about that type of instruction, I want to first open with the reason why we are using differentiated instruction for rate and level as our primary service. One, it is mandated by ODE as the best practice for supporting gifted learners across our state, but it's mandated because it is research-based and the most effective way our gifted students learn. So what I have here on this slide is an excerpt from some research about another common way that you see gifted programs and gifted services provided in this country. So it may seem familiar to you based on if your child was in our district for a longer period of time. This might look more familiar to how they received services earlier on. And it may also ring a bell to you if you yourself were identified gifted growing up in American public schools. It's not uncommon. So I'm just going to read this short excerpt. Perhaps it should be no surprise that students aren't achieving more in gifted classrooms when most educators admit they don't even try to teach advanced material in them. A 2019 survey of teachers in gifted programs found they primarily focused on, quote, enrichment activities, such as creative, fun projects and critical thinking exercises and discussions, keeping children on grade level material rather than moving them ahead to advanced academic content. So in this survey, this big analysis of this 2019 survey that I think covered several thousand gifted students across 5 or 6 school districts in 3 different states, is that they were describing gifted classrooms. So that pull-out model where students who are identified talented and gifted are served by separate teachers outside of their main classroom. And so even though that's not necessarily what we did at TTSD in the past, we did have services that were kind of similar where students were pulled out to work with a tag specialist for certain parts of their school day or their school week, or maybe even just certain times during the month. And the activities that they might have done more resemble what we see in that survey, what teachers were reporting. Next slide, please. So continuing with a few excerpts from other research on the same topic of gifted classrooms and pull-out services and enrichment, not actually serving our gifted students and where they are in their learning. I'll just read 2 more brief quotes. A large survey of 2,000 elementary schools in 3 states found that not much advanced content is actually being taught to gifted students. The 3rd most common focus in gifted curriculums is to give students more projects and games, so-called extension activities that are tangentially related to their grade level content. So as opposed to offering that, what differentiation for rate and level does is it keeps students in the classroom working on grade level standards, but actually deepening their understanding so that they actually have conceptual understanding of those topics and skills before being moved on to other content, and that they remain in the classroom community among their fellow peers and scholars, contributing to that learning and also benefiting from the diverse perspectives and skill sets that their peers are offering. And instead of actually leaving the classroom and then doing, as the quote says, work that's only tangentially related to the classroom content and skills, they're actually deepening their understanding of the topics that are being taught. Moving forward, high quality instruction that helps kids who've already mastered the basics go deeper into the material may ultimately be beneficial, and annual state assessments may not do a good job of measuring this kind of depth, creativity, or critical thinking. So the problem with pull-out services or separate classrooms for gifted learners, we've seen that again, and this is just a superficial overview of some of that exhaustive research, but what it does is that it's not serving gifted students because, one, it does tend, these gifted classrooms actually have the least amount of differentiated instruction in them. There's an assumption that all the students who are placed in those classrooms are all learning at a particular rate and level for all content that might be covered throughout an entire year in an entire subject. Whereas we know there is no research to support that that is the case for any one student, that they should be learning at a particular pace and rate and depth and complexity for all topics all the time. So it tends to assume abilities of tag students, which can then lead to high expectations without the actual support, instruction, or clear expectations of success criteria that students need in order to be successful. And what the research shows is that that eventually leads to things like underachievement, chronic underachievement sometimes, procrastination, sometimes crippling procrastination, a fear of failure, avoiding work that is actually at their true rate and level, avoiding challenges, and then ultimately questioning their own abilities and even their own identity as a talented and gifted student. Next slide. So instead of that, what our services do is that we keep students in the classroom, and they are served primarily by their classroom teacher, by instructing students at their evolving assessed rate and level, depending on the standard, skill, or content that's being taught. So what that means is, if you are a student who is academically talented in math, you are enrolled in a math course, your teacher is not seeing your tag identification and making large assumptions about your abilities and the rate and level of which you're going to learn all the content in that year's course. Instead, the teacher is going to continuously assess your rate and level as you progress from one standard to the next, one unit of learning to the next. And based on that, identify what your true rate and level of learning for that topic is, and modify learning tasks so that you're actually learning something new. You're deepening your understanding of something you already are proficient with. You're learning it in a 360-degree capacity. And once you have mastered it, you're moving on to new content. In addition to that, we also aim to, it's our TTSD's mission to provide social emotional learning support that is ideally targeted to the unique social and emotional needs of the gifted population, which we have covered thoroughly in another community meeting evening from last year. And that recording is still available on our website if you do want to revisit that topic. And in addition to that, students and families benefit from these gatherings that we're starting to do regularly, having launched them last year and gotten some good feedback from you, the community, that this outreach and partnership building has been productive. So that's also part of how we're serving our students. Next slide. So again, like Melissa said, tonight's focus is really on, okay, I've mentioned this differentiation for rate and level several times. And if you were with us last year, you heard about it many times last year as well. And when we put out a feedback survey last April at the end of our last community meeting, we saw overwhelming requests for more information about what does that kind of instruction look like? How do we know that it's happening in our child's school? What can we do if it's not? So that's what we really want to dive a little more deeply into right now. So I gave just a brief definition of what that looks like, differentiation for rate and level, and I'm going to point out a few of its benefits. And as I walk through exactly what it looks like, I'd love for you to keep these points in mind. So as we're looking at some examples of it, thinking about how this type of model in the classroom cultivates that independent learning ability for your talented and gifted students. How does it help them take a little bit of ownership in their learning experience and advocate for themselves and make appropriate choices about their rate and level of learning? How does this model, as opposed to that pull-out gifted classroom model we saw in the research, how does it expose students to increasingly diverse perspectives and problem-solving methods, communication styles and tools and ways of thinking than if they were in a more homogeneous setting? How does it ensure that students thrive in that productive struggle, that experience where we're just have that right fit learning challenge, where we are engaging with new and unfamiliar content or skills, but we also have the tools and the guidance to be successful with it? How does it ensure that we fill gaps in our learning while also engaging in higher level thinking? So as opposed to a gifted pullout model where there may be assumptions about our rate and level, we are also getting that opportunity to fill any gaps we have in content or skills. And how does it offer content acceleration when students do demonstrate a readiness? So some concerns about moving away from a pullout model or a tracked services model for gifted students is that perhaps our students won't be accelerated as efficiently as maybe they would otherwise. So as we look through these examples, be thinking about, well, how does this model actually ensure that our students would also move on with new content once they've demonstrated through data and assessment tools that they're actually ready for that so that they can be successful with it. Next slide. So to ensure that we are speaking about the same things, I want to take a moment and just define what we mean by rate and level. Those are obviously two very common words in the English language, but in terms of instruction, I want to be clear that by rate, we're talking about the pace at which a student is successfully progressing through curriculum after being placed at an appropriate level. So the way you can think about rate is the pace at which the student needs to work in order to maintain that productive struggle I was describing. So as soon as that productive struggle becomes actually quite easy review, now if that happens earlier for one student than another, then we're talking about their rate being at a certain pace. And for other students, that might take longer for something new to become comfortable. So another way we think about it is the time it takes for a student to kind of pop. If you imagine a bag of popcorn and the different kernels popping at different times, some students need a certain number of practice opportunities with a skill or new content before they're ready to move on to the next or deepen their understanding of it, while others may need very few practice opportunities. So when we talk about a student's rate and level, we're not just talking about the depth of knowledge that they're able to engage with, the intensity and complexity of the content or skill. We're also talking about that pacing at which they're going through that curriculum. So then level would be that place where they're actually encountering knowledge and skills not yet learned or mastered. So for one student, they may be entering a topic completely new to it. They have very little prior knowledge or background context for it. whereas another student may already have acquired some context and background knowledge and is ready to begin the learning at a deeper level. So I have a few examples on the slides of rate and level. And again, just a reminder that all of these slides will also be uploaded to our TAG website, which we will briefly tour at the end of tonight to make sure you all know how to get there very easily. So I want to just let you know we may not be covering every detail on the slides, but that they are there for your reference. Next slide, please. So another simple way to think about rate and level is to think about it as diagnosing what a student needs, where their rate and level currently are, what they are capable of doing. So diagnosing where they are and then prescribing the learning tasks and modifying their learning experience in the classroom based on that diagnosis. So when we're talking about diagnosing, that would mean using pre-assessments before launching a new unit of learning, as well as summative assessments at the end of a significant period of the curriculum to measure how much students have actually learned, as well as ongoing formative assessments throughout the learning process that are ultimately used daily to monitor students' progress and their evolving rate and level. So, for example, a student might have popped with a certain skill that was taught early on in the unit, and the teacher may now have information about their rate of learning. However, when the unit progresses and they get into more advanced content, their rate may slow down. So this need to, at an ongoing basis, monitor students' evolving, changing rate and level is key before prescribing what they're going to be doing tomorrow. So again, comparing back to those opening slides, to pull out services models where we see less of this diagnosing and prescribing actually happening, and more assumptions being made about all students who are placed in that class being ready for a standard pace and level throughout the entire unit, or even more through the entire course. So simply put, it's less about, so our gifted services are less about, engaging, just pure engagement of students and extra tasks and independent research projects, all of which have their place in the classroom and may be stimulating and enriching for our students. And we're not saying that those don't have a place in the classroom, but that is not what we're talking about when we're talking about their services being instruction in all of their classes that is differentiated for their actual rate and level of learning that content or skill. Next slide. So to make this even clearer, we have a what it is and what it is not table here. So I want to it's a lot of the same information I've just presented, but in a side-by-side format to help you kind of see a little bit more what this might look like in various classrooms. So on the left is what we've described here already: diagnosing and prescribing, meeting students where they are in the learning process to actually achieve maximum growth and depth in their learning. Versus on the right, what it is not is, well, one, obviously teaching the same content to all students at the same pace. And I think we all have memories of being in some classroom at some point where that was the instruction that was happening. There was a teaching at a certain assumed pace and rate and level for the classroom, and some were finding it really easy and swimming along. Others were finding it just right. They were in that productive struggle, and yet others were really getting left behind. So it's certainly not that. It's also not just offering challenge options to talented and gifted identified students in the classroom. So teaching a lesson at an assumed rate and level, and then if students finish it quite early and they're very successful with the tasks, then having the option to move on to a challenging task. So even if that challenging task is on topic and still related to the content being taught, it still wouldn't quite be diagnosing and prescribing if the student had to go through other learning tasks just to get to the learning that was actually at their rate and level. So another example of what it isn't is engaging but not actually rigorous assignment options that are matching a student's rate and level of learning. So you might have, I know this was my experience growing up in gifted programs in California public schools, was a lot of engaging projects being pulled out to work on building a bridge or measuring something in the sand outside in the playground, or getting hands-on with projects, or even a field trip leaving campus. So certainly engaging, but not necessarily at the depth of knowledge and rigor that maybe we were capable of diving into at that time. And also not necessarily related even to the content we were learning all day in school. So similarly, an extra project or independent study. And I want to point out that, again, none of those things are bad or don't have a place in the classroom. Certainly an extra project that can be very hands-on and enriching and help our students gain a deeper conceptual understanding of what they're learning is certainly valued. And if that were assigned at a student's rate and level when they demonstrate readiness for that, then that is an example of differentiation for rate and level and our gifted services that we provide. But simply having students go along with content and assignments and learning experiences that do not take into consideration where they are with rate and level, and then offering extra projects or challenge options or independent study on top of that would not be an example. Next slide. So again, on the left, what it is, when you think about how we're describing this, what would follow is that this kind of instruction in the classroom does lead to flexible dynamic grouping as students' needs shift. So another thing you wouldn't see in the classroom is that all tech students are grouped together all the time, or all advanced students with, whatever the topic is are grouped together all the time. So the groupings would be dependent, again, on students' evolving needs, their evolving rate and level as you're going through the curriculum and deepening it and changing the pace. And students are, well, I really got this one. I only need this topic or this skill. I only needed a couple practice opportunities with that. But as we moved on, I'm actually right there in my productive struggle and I need more time here. And maybe I even need more supports to be successful. So again, it avoids assuming the abilities of students, and these differentiated assignments would be in lieu of other work, not everyone's doing all of the same work first, and then the differentiation happens as an after, as like an earned reward or earned opportunity. So sometimes you may see that your child is being asked to do work that maybe they are finding not in their zone of proximal development, that place where they're at a productive struggle. But then you might ask, well, maybe this is where the teacher is gathering information and data about where the student currently is. So it's not that everything your student is going to bring home or every learning task that they do in class is going to be at that rate and level. Some of those learning tasks and experiences are going to be formative assessments that are helping teachers calibrate and really find their true rate and level. Okay, next slide. So speaking of that, how do we know? How do teachers know in these big classes with mixed ability students? How do they know what students know for any given skill or standard that they're teaching? So there are, obviously a huge number of different types of ways to gather data about what students know, or in short, assessments. And I want to clarify that you may have assessments given in the classroom for 3 different contexts. You might have assessments to measure what students have learned. So those would often be summative assessments given at key points throughout the year, at the end of units that have been taught, units of instruction. And you might have assessment of how students are currently learning, assessments to learn. So assessments for learning, where they're more formative. They're given at key points throughout the learning process to see how students are progressing. And assessments at the very start of a learning process to diagnose what do students already know with this larger topic or skill set. So in order for teachers to diagnose on an ongoing basis, we can gather assessment data that's more meaningful to determine students' evolving rate and level if we consider assessments that, go ahead and give me a click, please, that have a low floor and a high ceiling. So sometimes we might give an assessment that it comes back and everybody got 100% or did quite well or missed the same 1 or 2 questions, maybe because of a technicality or detail in the question. Maybe it was a little misworded or slightly tricky. So in that sense, we're getting maybe our assessment had a very low floor. If everyone did so well with it, I'm not really actually diagnosing or finding out where the ceiling is for what they know. I may have to now administer another assessment tool. So we do want to make sure our ceiling is high enough to really uncover the limits of where all our diverse students are with this learning, this new learning topic. Click again, please. We also want to make sure that our students know how this data is going to be used so that they are performing authentically on it and giving us actually the information about what they do know. So I know in my role where I do advocate for our students in our district with their tag services and have conversations with teachers and provide professional development and coaching opportunities for teachers, this comes up quite a lot that the teacher did actually try to diagnose what the student knew. But when I talked to the student about that assessment, whatever tool it was, they weren't really clear that that's how it was being used and they didn't put their best effort in it. Or maybe they were clear and for other factors, they didn't show what they really needed to show. And so, of course, there is some responsibility for the student to do that, but the more intentional we are with how we create our assessment tools and the more variety we have and how we offer those to students, the more authentic they'll actually be when given the opportunity to show what they know. Another click, please. So one is to make sure that if our assessments if the goal of them is to find out where students are in their learning, what their rate and level is now compared to what it was last week, then a formative assessment is ultimately ideally not graded. So it's an assessment to gather information and monitor progress. It's not summative where a grade might be warranted. So we do know from research that when those assessments have somewhat high stakes, that our students' cortisol levels do go up, which impacts their ability to perform and truly show what they know. So with these ongoing tools that we're using to find out what students know, we want to make sure that they're low stress and that students feel safe responding. Another click, please. We also want to make sure we're offering multimodal assessments. So one example would be in an ELA class, English Language Arts, students do a lot of speaking and writing, class discussion, writing, short answers, long answers, essays, journal prompts, a lot of writing. So if the skill or content we're trying to monitor progress with is not actually related to writing skills, then we want to think about, are we over relying on assessment tools that require writing? Because then we may be getting information about a student's rate and level with writing skills and not necessarily the standard we're teaching right now. So our teachers are learning and refining all of these different ways to gather the best data. So I'm not sharing this information to say that, you know, every assessment option your student is given is going to be ideally calibrated for their rate and level, but I am sharing with you a high level way that we as teachers think about how we're trying to find out what students know. And that, you know, your students may have taken an assessment at school that may not meet all of these criteria. But then the next question might be, well, was that assessment summative to measure what they've already learned after being taught for several weeks? Was it diagnostic? Was it to measure where they are in the learning? And we're sharing this information to you so that you can have really better questions to ask your own child and your child's teacher to think about how have they demonstrated what they know, what their rate and level is. And how could maybe, if they didn't quite get an opportunity to truly show what they know, what could they try? What's another option? Next slide. So once we know what students know, like we said before, we diagnose and then we prescribe. We prescribe learning tasks and experiences that are modified to students' rate and level of learning. We use a framework called the depth of knowledge, which has 4 levels of depth and complexity. So you could take the depth of knowledge framework and overlay it on any question from an assessment or any essay prompt or any science textbook quiz or anything that comes from the classroom and try to find, well, is this at a 1, 2, 3, or 4? So I'm going to leave these very brief descriptions of each level on the screen for you. And these are really condensed down to their essential pieces. Really, depth of knowledge, you can obviously dive quite deep into it and get a more robust picture of what each level really is across all content areas. But for purposes of tonight, we really just wanted to give you a brief snapshot of each of those 4 levels so you can get a sense of how are the learning tasks then modified. If Shavetta was saying that they don't get some extra fancy enrichment project, or they're not getting pulled out of the class or doing some big independent study or going on a field trip or whatever it is, or doing some extra credit challenge work, well, then what are they doing? What is the learning like when it's modified to their rate and level? So a DOK level 1 might be something that is simply recall and reproduce. It has one right answer. Students are reproducing sort of memorized or just learned material, definitions of terms, application of a straightforward formula that was modeled, and they're just being asked to do that same formula in a very rehearsed and predictable way. DOK2 might now involve more steps to the process and involve maybe a little bit of explanation, but still ultimately one answer. And then there's a significant shift then when we get to DOK3. Now we're taking concepts to new contexts that may not have already been excessively modeled and rehearsed. So it's less of a habitual response. We're just replicating back. There may be multiple solution pathways that different students may see and attempt approaches to solving that problem. It will require explanation and some strategic thinking. And now DOK4 would be where we're actually taking this learning out of the context of that classroom subject altogether. So we're not just talking about finding area and perimeter of shapes anymore. Maybe now we're actually crossing into another discipline and incorporating things we're learning in the social sciences or current events or something we read in language arts to explore real world applications and global applications and connect to data sets from across experiences and subject areas. So you can see that it builds not only in depth of understanding, but also the complexity of the work that they're actually doing. But I do want to point out that this DOK framework is not a ladder. It's not that students need to prove that they can do DOK 1 before they can have access to DOK 2 level work, and then 3, and then 4. Actually, DOK 4 level work, so that high ceiling we were talking about earlier, is accessible to students who may not yet have mastered some of the more rudimentary fundamentals of the topic. So for example, a student who may not read fluently yet in 2nd or 3rd grade can still engage with high-level questions about a text and how characters are developing and how a character in a story might react to something like a COVID pandemic. So really doing high-level thinking without the DOK 1 level skills as a prerequisite. Next slide.
Shweta, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Is there any way you could slow down and just pause between each explanation of content? Our interpreter, it's so much that she's not keeping up with you.
Yes, I'm sorry, Lisa.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm sorry for that. Yes. And I do want to remind folks too that we are going to share all of these slides. So if I do end up, for purposes of time, skipping over anything to maintain a slower pace, you will have access to all of the material on the slides. So on this slide, what we have is pretty much similar information, just presented in a different visual. So you can see side by side the differences between DOK 1 and 2 type tasks and DOK 3 to 4 type tasks. The difference being, as you go from 1 and 2 to 3 and 4, is that cognitive demand of the task, the cognitive rigor of it for the students increase. So for one example, like we saw, like I just mentioned, you may have one correct answer and a narrow solution path in a DOK 1 or 2 task, whereas in 3 or 4, you can see on the right, you'll have multiple options for how this problem might be attacked or approached. And there would not be only one answer you could imagine when asking a room full of students. With DOK 3 or 4, you would cross into other content domains. So you wouldn't be just limited to math, but you might be using math skills or math content to actually solve problems in another context altogether. So you might apply it to a current event situation where you may be using mathematical tools and models to consider the effects of the COVID pandemic on different populations and examining multiple data sets and drawing rich conclusions. On the next slide, I have an actual demonstration of how a teacher might use the DOK framework to increase the depth and complexity of a task to give a student based on what they've now learned about that student's rate and level. So for example, if the class is reading a text, in this example, Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, a DOK 3 level task might ask students to use reasoning and evidence from the text to explain how the character Margie develops throughout the story. Now for DOK 4, where we want to go outside of that context of the novel and outside of the skills just in our English class, we may ask students a question, just modify that original question by asking them, how does the author's development of Margie, the character, complicate or reinforce the popular culture's representation of Muslim girls? So now we're going outside of the world of the novel and of ELA class to really look at society as a whole, specifically representations of characters like Margie, Muslim girls, and make some higher level comparisons and conclusions from that. There are 2 other examples on the slide that you can reference at another time. Go ahead and click. Yeah, that was the DOK 3. And here are a few examples. of how you might just modify that question to get to that higher depth of knowledge. Let's quickly look at a math example. Next slide. Here is a DOK1 assignment, and I'll have you think in your head back to the slide earlier where we described DOK1, 2, 3, and 4, and kind of use that language that was on that slide, what you remember about a DOK1 as you hear this question and think about, okay, does that have one solution to it? Is that, if you were teaching percents, is that a pretty familiar situation that students would have practiced extensively and seen modeled? If the restaurant bill is $10, how much would a 20% tip be? Now, to change that to a DOK2, if the total bill is $20 after Juan included a 20% tip, what was the cost of his food items? So we're still getting at one answer. Go ahead and click for me for that DOK2 example. But now we have a little bit more steps involved and a slightly less common scenario than a student might see in their modeled in class repeatedly, but we still have that one answer. And then click again, and let's see how we might change that task to get to a DOK3 level, where we have now students thinking of different combinations of purchases that are possible when Ahmed has $15 to spend and wants to give a 20% tip. So now we are involving strategic reasoning. This might invite conversation and testing of ideas and problem-solving methods, more than one possible answer. So that's just one example, well, an example in English language arts and one in math to get you thinking of how the depth of knowledge framework of 1, 2, 3, or 4 helps teachers make subtle and efficient modifications to a learning task to keep all students really still in that same room, learning shared content, and then but actually add a depth of knowledge that is matching their rate and level. So I know that was a lot of information and a kind of a quick overview, and I probably spoke a bit too fast, but I'm going to stop there and just again invite you to learn more on our TAG website that we'll share later, and also reach out to the people that we'll list at the end of the night for you to learn more and ask more questions about this. But I hope that gives you a little bit more clarity than you had last year about what the gifted services actually look like, or what we strive for them to be for your students. So I'm going to pass it over to Melissa J. And thank you for following along.
Before Melissa J, though, this is Melissa B. And one thing, can we move forward 2 slides, please? One more. Thank you. We are going to move into the final section of our presentation tonight. And I just want to take a minute to acknowledge a lot of the questions that are coming into the chat that we have not yet answered. And a lot of it is because we are hoping to answer them through the presentation. So know that we are seeing the questions, and if your question doesn't get answered in a way that is enough information, please feel free to reach out to us again as we are working through this. And the other thing that I want to just acknowledge as a leader in this district is just to be humble and say that we don't have all of the answers yet. And it's not perfect. What's happening in our classrooms right now is not perfect. And we recognize that, and we are working as hard as we possibly can to get to a level that we are providing the level of education that we believe all students deserve. And I know that that is a hard thing to hear, and it's not an excuse. I'm not going to make any excuses about it, but I do want to acknowledge that we know that there are classrooms right now that teachers haven't done any sort of work around assessing for rate and level. And we recognize that system change also takes time. We started this work in January of this year. And so we are still working through a training plan, and we are still wanting to gather as much information from you all and partner with you so that we can provide the best education for your students as possible. But I know that it's not perfect, and we're working on it. And so that I just want to make sure that you hear that from me, as someone in leadership here and moving into this role, and that we are committed to ensuring that our system moves in this direction and that we are supporting our teachers to provide the best education possible for every student. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa, who is going to talk about some advocacy strategies and questions to talk with your teachers about.
All right, thank you, Melissa. Go ahead and switch to the next slide. So we did also want to give you another light touch on the topic of advocacy, especially with conferences happening this week. We did already dedicate an entire community meeting last year to this topic, and it goes into way more detail and specifics than I'm about to. So if at the end you would like a deeper dive into what that could look like and how to do it, please check out the recording of our community meeting from April of 2021 on the TTSD TAG website, and we'll be sharing that link in just a few minutes. So the big questions we ask ourselves as parents in regards to advocating for our children in TAG services is when we do it, is when to do it and what is the best way to approach it. Start by listening to your child about how school is going, which I'm sure everyone's kind of doing right now, but then ask some clarifying questions. A lot of times, if we hear that our child is bored, we jump to wanting to ask the teacher for more challenging work or for additional assignments. And there's nothing wrong with this, but after listening to what Shweta was just talking about with all the elements that go into services for rate and level, it might make the conversation with the teacher more productive if you narrow it down to some of the more specific needs. And then what we really mean when we say we want our students to be challenged is that we want them to have the opportunity to engage in productive struggle. Productive struggle helps build confidence in their abilities to work through something challenging and complete tasks and problems that are new and unfamiliar. Now, it's not to be confused with unproductive struggle where things are just too hard or they don't have the tools necessary to conquer the learning tasks. And then we know that they're actually being stretched and actually learning in this productive zone because they have the tools, supports, and prior knowledge to draw on in order to do those new and unfamiliar tasks. And then also as parents, we want to believe that our children's account of their experiences, but we also want to take into account that their experiences occur in a larger context. And I think a lot of you have asked questions about this in the chat as well. So sometimes the teacher has given the opportunity or multiple opportunities to demonstrate what they already know in the form of a pretest, a quiz, or another short assignment, so that instruction or activities can be modified based on their readiness level. But if the student doesn't realize that that's the purpose of those assignments, then they may not have put much thought or effort into the responses. So then the teacher is unable to make that connection between the assessment and their learning plan. So then in order to gauge where your child is or what their needs are, you could ask some of the questions on this list or come up with some of your own. Questions like, are you engaged in learning? Are there obstacles to engagement that are related to either academic, social, or emotional needs? Are you experiencing a productive struggle and learning something new? Or have you shown your readiness for complex and challenging work? And I think that last one's really important because that's how the teachers are going to know that they're ready for something new. And it's also ensuring that they are assessing for rate and level. So go ahead to the next slide, please. And then after speaking with your child and getting a more targeted sense of what their needs are, the classroom teacher should be your first point of contact when advocating for those needs. As a TAG specialist, we're all here to help support you and your child, but building that communication and relationship with the teacher is going to be your best path forward. They're the ones who are with your child every day, and they already have an established relationship with them. They're also the ones delivering instruction and providing those services on a daily basis. And this partnership begins either at back to school night, if you attended, or and at conferences, which are happening this week. And while these are a great starting point to really build that relationship, it's important to remember that it is an ongoing partnership that should not be limited to these two events, but it should be carried on throughout the year. So as you're thinking about conferences this week, just know that it's a first step and a real first point of contact, but really build that capacity and that relationship to continue the conversation with the teachers as the year progresses. All right, next slide, please. I wanted to walk you through some more specific examples of questions to ask your child's teacher, whether at conferences or in an email or phone call later on, depending on the needs of your child. So you could use questions like, how can my child feel engaged and that they're learning something new? When have you observed my student engaged in your class? And what are your observations of their needs? And what are ideas for meeting those needs? And then if the teacher's observations seem a lot different from yours, maybe try something like, hey, may I share what I've observed at home or what I'm hearing at home, to really get that conversation forward and moving where you want it to go. Okay, next slide, please. So maybe the situation is that you find out your child is finishing all their work super early or quickly and don't seem to have anything to do or know what to do. Try some of these. So then you could try some of these questions. What are other options of work that can engage my child in a productive struggle? Or how can we assess my child's level to ensure that he or she they're receiving an appropriate rate and level of instruction? And then this also invites the teacher to share what is already happening in the classroom so that you can collaboratively build on that and come up with a solution. All right, next slide, please. Okay, and as our students get older, it becomes more important for them to develop the language and tools to think about their own learning experiences and take a more active role in advocating for themselves. For those of you who will be participating in student-led conferences this week, it might be a good opportunity to have your child come up with a question or two beforehand to ask the teacher. So definitely make sure that their questions are authentic and reflect what they are thinking. But if they are feeling that the learning may not be matched to their rate and level, here are some examples of questions that the students might ask of their teachers. So they could say, I love work that allows me to incorporate and show off my creativity. Can we come up with a plan together to include more of that in my work this term? Or I'm feeling worried about this assignment because I don't think I have enough time to go into as much depth as I would like to. I was hoping to, and then have them explain their idea. And then is there a way to extend the deadline or let go of some other assignments to really give it justice? And then a situation like this, or any of these situations, may actually result in no change to the assignment, but it's possible that then the teacher would be able to explain more about their intentions and purposes with it. So maybe it's supposed to be more of a quick check, and knowing that and being on the same page ahead of time can help alleviate potential worry and stress for your child. Or they might say, I'm already familiar with this topic, whatever that topic may be. Is there a way to demonstrate what I already know? What are ways to make this more challenging? So this would be a really good way to tie into some of those concerns they're having about rate and level, making sure it's being assessed in the classroom. And we do acknowledge that this may not completely resolve the problem every time, and there are more people you can connect with if you need more support. So let's go ahead to the next slide. Again, that first point of contact should always be the teacher, but all of our school tag specialists are available to help as well. We have all 5 of the elementary tag specialists listed here with their schools, as well as Shveta Miller at the high school, the middle and high school levels. And then for those of you with students at the Tigard-Tualatin Virtual Academy, please contact Shveta if they're at the secondary level, or you can go ahead and contact the tag specialist at your home school if they're at the elementary level. Additional points of contact may be the counselors, school psychologists, the learning specialists, school administrators, or the principals. And then also the family liaisons or family partnership advocates are a fantastic resource, especially if you already have an established relationship with them. All of the tag specialists, all of our contact information, like our emails and phone numbers, are listed on the district tag website, which we'll be looking at now. If you'll go ahead and go to the next slide. And then I don't know if someone wants to put that link in the chat if we can, but our district's tag website contains all the recordings from these community meetings, the ones that have happened in the past, and then tonight's will appear there. So you can review them later or catch anything you missed. And it also goes over a lot of answers to many of the frequently asked questions about identification and services. And then it also includes Melissa Barron's contact information, as she is the district level administrator to contact for tag related inquiries. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Melissa B. to wrap us up.
Thank you so much. This was my first webinar experience, and so trying to type in the chats and respond to the questions, again, I know that we did not get to all of the questions, and we will circle back and follow up specifically with those that we didn't have the opportunity to answer tonight with specific answers as best we can. But as I said earlier, I also want to just acknowledge that there are some questions that we don't have answers to or have perfect answers to, and I will be honest and humble about those and reach out to you directly if there isn't an answer specifically to what you're asking. I do want to, again, thank you for your time. And if you could go to the next slide, please. We will be hosting another opportunity for a community night probably after the holiday break. So sometime after the first of the year will be our next round of community nights, and we will send out a survey to all of you to discuss potential topics for that particular night. And so watch for that in your email inbox. And in the meantime, if there are any specific questions, you have the contact information in these slides, and please feel free to reach out to any of us, and we will do our very best to answer your questions. And we have 2 minutes to spare. So again, just thank you for this night. Shweta, Melissa, anybody, anything else that we want to add as we close? All right, I think that was appropriate wait time. Again, thank you so much for your time tonight, and we look forward to working with you in the future. Have a good night.